Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about mass immigration and how we measure its success or failure. What is the criteria for determining success or failure, and then how can we go from there into saying, well, this has succeeded. Now we can look at say, the leftist moral thing where it's, well, you have to take in illiterate third world peasants because they only want a better life. I mean, what's wrong with that? Are you against that, you Nazi? But hey, hold on a minute, stop. If we bring in millions of, illiterate third world peasants, there's going to be a tiny proportion of them are going to be economically productive. They don't want to integrate. They don't speak the language. They have no skills. Many of them have IQ in the range of 70 to 80. What are we going to do with these people? There'll be a net drain on the economy. They'll create social dislocation. They'll reduce social trust in society. There is not a single benefit we can look at here. Now, the big multinationals may like it because, I'm not sure they do in any broad sense, but they may like it because they get cheaper floor sweepers or cheaper security guards or cheaper, folks who cut sandwiches or something like that. The absolute lowest of the low paid, repetitive type jobs, and they can pay those people less. I don't know how many jobs there are like that in the economy. I mean, are there a lot? But anyway, that's the so how we measure success is that big multinationals wanting super cheap labor for bullshit jobs, because that has the artificial effect of then creating more low-paid artificial bullshit jobs. So instead of just reducing the cost of labor in a small sector, it creates a boom in that sector in terms of employment, so that there perversely becomes a huge demand for people to work in takeout food shops and things like that, and cafes or whatever. And so where skills and English and ability to take written instructions and solve problems and complex, but that sort of isn't needed. You to say take that cup of coffee to table number 10. And that's it. That's the extent of the knowledge that they need. So this has artificially created a boom in businesses that are relying completely on slave labor to get by. They're not viable businesses. So we have this massive, in the West now, certainly in Australia, this massive non-viable sector, non-viable commercial sector that's only kept alive on life support by slave labor that's being brought in from and supplied by illiterate third world peasants. So that's not a benefit or a boom to society, far from it, in my view. So let's come to the core issue, though, of immigration. How do we measure success? Now, by any reasonable person will say, well, the success is people that integrate into the host culture quickly, and who are able to produce a net benefit to the society and to the treasury and the exchequer and all this sort of thing. So they're going to find a job quickly. They're going to, through that job, they'll pay income tax and so on, and therefore they won't need welfare or not very much of it, and therefore there'll be a benefit to the society. They'll generate tax revenue, a positive amount of tax revenue. A surplus of tax revenue to the society, and that's a good thing. So those would be the two key. Now we can sort of subdivide that and say, well, people that maybe are fit and healthy and won't need to use medical services, or people that are young enough where they're going to procreate and have children who will grow up to be workers and consumers. There are other subsets you can look at there. But those would be the main things. Now, certainly in Australia, it's had quite a high migrant intake, and I didn't really think about migration until I was probably 10 or 11 years old or something. And around that time, I sort of thought about it. I lived in an area where there weren't really any, there were not that many migrants in the overall scheme of things. then went briefly to an area where there was a lot of migrants, and at that point, it sort of appeared on my childhood radar, and I've kept more or less an eye on it ever since, because I noticed how certain people from certain parts of the world didn't integrate. Even if they were born in Australia, they didn't seem to be integrating, unless they're very different behaviours. And this sort of struck me as strange. I assumed, everyone in the world sort of kind of behaved the same, but not so. So where you pick your migrants from, excuse me, where they come from is pretty important, because that'll give you a good indication of how long it will take them to integrate. So say in the case of Australia, if they come from another first world white country, they speak English, then they're going to integrate pretty quickly. Say a kid that arrives, in Australia, this is a migrant kid from another white English-speaking country. Say they arrive when they're, 5 years, or anywhere between the age of, 0 and 10, 11, 12, somewhere around there, 13 maybe. That kid will integrate within their own generation. So they'll be as Australian as anyone else in that time. Again, assuming they come from an English-speaking country, a first world English-speaking country, and they've got an urbanized, professional sort of, their parents are in some sort of professional employment. So they'll integrate, again, arriving as a young child, they'll integrate within their own lifetime. Parents not so much, but still to a large extent. Then, of course, their children that are then born in Australia, they're as Australian as anyone. You wouldn't know the difference. So now this is the. But let's have a look at, say, from another English-speaking country where they come from. They're not professional. They live in, say, a fairly remote rural area, that type of thing. They've got no urban exposure to urban living. They would struggle. It would take them a bit longer. Excuse me, I'm going to have to take a sip of water here. It would take them a bit longer to integrate, but they still would. Their children definitely would. So we've got a separation here between urban and professional, language, of course. But even where the language is the same, people that are not urban and professional, living in a rural, maybe a farming community, that sort of thing, they'll take longer again. So already we've got another criteria to consider. That even people, say, coming to Australia, for example, people from England, something I noticed as a kid, people coming from England, if they came from a rural sort of, lower working class type area, that type of thing, or even the slum areas of some of the down at heel cities, like the Manchesters and Liverpools, they took longer. It took them a while longer to integrate. Whereas, they didn't. You don't require social skills in the places they come from, and that really did stand out. I've had this thing 3 cups of coffee, but anyway, so there's differences in the background they come from, and now in Australia, certainly in the 50s and 1960s, the Australian government used to keep hostels. So mass migrants, at the time it would pass for mass. It's nowhere near the numbers that you see today, but migrants would come in and be put up in these hostels, which were communal housing in effect, and they were permitted to stay there until they could get on their feet, until they could find a job, this sort of thing. Interpreters were provided, free English lessons, and employers could, factories and things like employers could come along. Now, it wasn't that hard to get a job if your English was pretty ordinary, because in a factory, where it was a repetitive task in a factory, they could show you what to do, and then there would be someone there that spoke the language. So it wasn't impossible for someone that spoke very little English and had maybe minimal skills. But the majority, not all, but the majority of people coming had skills. They were, there was people from Italy who didn't really speak much English, but they were, concreters or carpenters and so on. they would be, given some sort of a bridging course, and then they were accepted. So there was a lot of people coming from non-English speaking countries that spoke some English, but they had a qualification that was useful and needed. The carpentry was something that was, there was big demand for carpenters and concreters and bricklayers, architects, that sort of thing. But if you look at a ship's manifest, like a migrant ship's manifest back in the 50s and 60s, then you look down the list of professions, everybody seems to have a skill, or maybe not everybody, some would have been just labourers, but nearly everybody had a skill that would have been needed in the economy. So they would have found jobs pretty much straight away, or certainly within a short space of time. Now, there were still people who came from rural areas. It could be, say, a farming family from rural Holland, and they didn't speak any English, and they would come to Australia, and they would find it harder, and they wouldn't integrate. Now, another measure of integration or lack of it is people who come here as younger folks, when they start to grow up, who do they marry? Now, for the Italians and the Greeks, particularly from rural areas, which was the majority of the migrants that came to Australia from Greece and Italy, they would marry other Italians. So you've got a situation where a 19, 20-year-old Italian guy arrives. He's a rural Italian guy, doesn't speak a lick of English, and he's married. He gets to Australia and marries an Italian lady who's arrived, and then their children, they have children when they get here, and then they marry, will only marry other Italians, and then the grandchildren, they in turn marry. So when you look at rural peasant stock, they tend to stay very much in their clan, tribal diaspora. So you've even got the grandchildren marrying other Italians, or Greek grandchildren marrying other Greeks, and so on, even though they're both born in Australia. So this is a difference here, where, say, say people coming from England or even Western Europe generally, but they speak pretty decent English when they arrive, and they've got qualifications and credentials. Instead of falling back on the community, their Italian community, their Greek community, their Dutch community, whatever, instead of falling back on that, they integrate quickly into the host society. They get the jobs quickly. They make local friends. Their children then marry, locally born Anglo people, and so they integrate seamlessly in the community. And again, they're not recipients of welfare or anything like that. So they clearly, if you want to be and stay a rich country, high productivity rich country, those are the people that you bring, people that integrate quickly and seamlessly, and again produce an economic surplus. There's no other measure for a successful immigration policy. Again, you can have subsets, for example, a family with a lot of children, maybe, or younger people that'll procreate. Now, talking to people that used to be work in the migrants hostels that used to exist in Australia in the 50s and 60s. They offered free English lessons. Every day free English lessons were on. There were also evening lessons and lessons especially for children. There was free schooling and everything. They could go. Children could go to the local schools, and there were all these facilities laid on. But it was surprising how poorly patronised it was. Most of these, the peasant level type migrants, and again, they could be peasants from Holland or I don't know, rural France or something. They wouldn't bother coming to the English language lessons. So they come to a country that only spoke English, they wouldn't do it. And there's a number of people that came from, just talking to they're now, in their 60s or 70s, but who came from the post-World War II refugee type camps in Europe. And they wanted only, they had a look at the countries, and they only wanted to go to rich white countries that spoke English. It was America, Canada, Australia. Those were the options, and so they in these refugee camps there were free English lessons. You could go to cultural sort of, this is what life is like in Australia, that type of thing, and that they never bothered to go. So they arrive in Australia not speaking a single word of English, and as they think back on their experience coming to Australia, they say Australia was an outrageous, racist, evil, fascist, Nazi country, because there were no interpreters, free interpreters laid on. There was no free this, free that, free so and so. They should have welcomed us with a fucking red carpet, and so that means that they're all. And so these people, they arrived as young children, or the mother was pregnant when they arrived, so she was born in Australia, but she insists she was the victim of the most terrible racism. And in their house, the parents only spoke in it's some sort of dialect of Belarusian, as I understand, but they only spoke that language in the house. So when they made no effort to make sure the children could speak English. So when it's 5 years old, the children went to school. This girl went to school. She couldn't speak a single word of English, but she insists the fault of that was the evil fascist Nazi Australians, because well, isn't it your parents? Don't you think they should take some responsibility? You. Oh no, it's the fascist Nazi white Australia. Okay, fine. So integration takes. So they never integrated. They're still nursing the hurts. Today, they would only marry other Belarusians and this type of thing. But both the girls decided they wouldn't have any children because Australia was such a racist country. They didn't want the children to suffer the racism. Well, what racism are you talking about exactly? So integration and attitudes towards a local host culture and these sort of things play an important part, and something that I think should be the criteria for selecting. Now look at the current migrant selection today. The vast majority come from third world peasant countries where the average IQ is sort of 70. They don't speak any English. They've got no qualifications or credentials. Many have had at best 2 years of schooling, and that would be in some bullshit, school out in the sticks. So they arrive in the West, and you couldn't get people who are less prepared. And the less prepared and less able they are to integrate, the more they gather in their their racial diaspora ghetto type things, and then the longer it takes to integrate. Now, in the case of Indians, or the subcontinent people generally, but India in particular, and India, by the way, is supplying the greatest number of mass migrants across the whole English-speaking diaspora, whether it's Canada, Australia, or Britain. So they make up a huge, not only in the United States where you get the illegal Mexicans coming across the border. So, but if you look at legal migration, Indians make up the majority of that in the United States as well. So now Indians, even though they may speak the language sort of, heavily accented, but nonetheless speak the language, they don't integrate. Their reluctance to integrate is just off the charts. So even after 4, 5, 6, 7 generations of being Western born, they still proudly state that they're Indian. They still only marry other Indians. They will send back to the village of their ancestors to get husbands and brides to keep the culture and the spirituality and the genetics 100% pure. And so their only interest in integration, if you could call it that, their only interest is to take money from the white people. So white people, you have to give us jobs, you have to give us benefits and so on. But they've got no intention of integrating beyond that. Their role in the West is to take money. They only want to spend money with other Indians, and it's only with great reluctance they spend money outside of the Indian diaspora, only because they have to. So when we look at this in the wider immigration context, they're bad immigrants. They're not they don't integrate. They're not there to share and to build and to create. They're there to take what the white people have already created. And now there are exceptions. You can find exceptions for sure, but the exceptions are tiny, 1 or 2% at best. So when picking migrants, if you're a white first world, English-speaking country, the best source of migrants is white, other first world countries, and preferably English-speaking. Now, if a German or someone is Swede or something like that wants to migrate to Australia, that they're the sort of people that will go to night classes to learn English. And do everything they can to speak competent English before. Well, I want to go there. They speak English there. I need to at least be competent to speak the language. So they'll go out of their way. Whereas most cultures, they won't do that. Well, why should I do that? I mean, if they've got an IQ of 70, they probably struggle with it. But why should I do that? I'll just go there and claim benefits. So the idea of people coming from a culture where you can change the outcome of your life by hard work, sacrifice, diligence, and this sort of thing, that's not something they see in other cultures. They don't comprehend that. Even Indians struggle with it. Indians think that there's a fixed pot of money in the world, and the only way you can get more of it is by cheating someone else out of what they have. That's very much their attitude. Even the Brahmins, many of the Brahmins think that same way. So the idea in Western society that you can work hard, study hard, do things to change your circumstances and improve them, that's actually a uniquely Western view, and we forget that. And when we say, well, why is the West rich and why is the West industrious? Why is the West more productive? That's why, and that is a key and critical component of understanding and comprehending that in the West we're taught to believe we can materially improve our circumstances by studying hard at school, working hard, being diligent, delaying gratification. And that is a very uniquely Western view. And we need to understand the central role that plays in Western wealth and has played, continues to play, although it's being heavily diluted with the mass migration thing. So when choosing and selecting mass migrants, there's no rocket science here. People who come from similar cultures, similar systems of government and law and this sort of stuff, and speak the language, they will integrate relatively quickly. Especially if they're urbanized and have a professional class. But white people, as a percentage of the total world's population, there's not that many of them now to go around. So if you want migration from another white country, that's kind of frowned upon now. And well, why don't we bring in all these illiterate third world peasants and try and turn them into first world workers and consumers? And you can see the intent there, but the reality is it's not working out. It's been a horrible, horrible mistake, and we're all paying the price for that now. Being a Tassus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for listening.